Bonjour tout le monde.
Hello, everybody. Before we begin, I'd like to come back to a point that was brought up, that is the delay between the discovery last Monday of the body and today's press conference, simply to tell you that obviously there was an issue where we had to identify formally the body. As you know, the lifeless body has to be identified by the coroner. There was also some investigation points to complete, and the most important thing, and you'll understand that before I talk to you today, we wanted to meet the family. We wanted to be able to explain to them and to answer their questions. And I think that it's absolutely normal that we did that, and we did this morning. So now I hope that I'll be able to answer some of your questions. I know that you've got many of them. I want to tell you that I won't have answers to all of your questions, but I'm going to try as much as possible to answer your questions. Today I'm going to try to stick to the facts, to what we know, and I don't want to go into theories or hypotheses. What's important is to stick to facts. So, since last night, we've had the confirmation of the identity of the body that was found at the end of the day on Monday as being Martin Carpentier's body. Obviously, for us, this puts an end to the criminal investigation because the investigation demonstrates that there was nobody else who was involved in this crime. So for us, the criminal investigation is over, and now the coroner's office will take over. I don't want to come back to everything that was said and everything that was done, everything that was reported, but I want to come back to the sequence of events with 4 precise moments. Obviously, I'm going to begin with the event that started. So the car accident, the car that was driven by Martin Carpentier on July 8th on Highway 20 at kilometer 288. I'd like to tell you that, first of all, what the investigation is showing is that it wasn't a deliberate action. It's not something that was premeditated. So the collision inquiry that was done shows that it was truly an accident that was not intentional. And when we looked at the scene, there were some braking scene. So we see that he tried to gain control of the vehicle but did not succeed. So for us, up until that time, there was nothing that was premeditated or deliberate. However, for us, this accident is really a tipping point because it's as of that moment that the behavior that we can all qualify as abnormal is taken in effect, and it's from that moment we'll begin in terms of the behavior that's at the heart of our investigation. So I would like to tell you that I don't want to elaborate as to the state of mind, the potential state of mind, the motivations, the reasons, simply because there's a coroner's inquiry that will follow and we will contribute to this investigation. But today, I'm not going to speculate as to this. The reality is that the suspect has died, so there are some things that we will never truly know, and I don't want to speculate as to this. I'm telling you right now. Obviously, the second event that I want to come back on is the introduction of an RV, and we talked about this. So that occurred after the car accident. It's about 1.7 kilometers away, and the inquiry has shown us with the DNA that will be taken on site that Martin Carpentier is the one who introduced himself into this trailer. At that time, we don't have the DNA of the 2 girls, but through the investigation, we're quite certain that the girls were still there, but however, that they did not go inside the trailer. The suspect continues until the spot where, unfortunately, we will find the bodies of the 2 young girls. At that point, for us, that's where the irreparable was done. What the investigation shows is that even if the girls were injured during the car accident, it's at that time that the suspect kills them with a blunt object. I'm not going to go into greater detail on the circumstances of the deaths. I don't think that it's necessary, but I just want to tell you that for us it's clear that it's a double murder and that the girls were killed at that time with a blunt object. Then the suspect continues on, and now we're at 5.5 kilometers from the car accident, which is where we found the body of Martin Carpentier. All of these events that I've just shared with you, the 4 main moments in the sequence of events for us, happened very quickly. So in fact, what the investigation shows with the autopsy results, with all the other elements that we have, is that at dawn on the 9th of July, Well, the irreparable was already done. All the elements that I have already mentioned to you were already committed. The girls, unfortunately, were already dead, and the suspect as well. That's what the investigation is showing us. Perhaps I can come back. I know that we talked a lot about everything that was done, but I think it's important to highlight the work that was done. More than 1,000 tips were processed by investigators during these 2 weeks. 1,000 tips that are not just received, but that are looked at, validated, compared to other information that we already have, and which leads to an investigation. We have to go meet witnesses, get some video recordings, for example. You'll understand that this colossal work to follow up on these 1,000 tips, and that's done in parallel to the search. And the most visible thing that you see, because everybody can see the police officers are there in the field, there were 720 properties that were checked by police officers, and that is added to the walkers, the dogs, the plane from Transport Canada with the heat detector, the helicopters and drones. All of the means necessary were put at the disposal of police officers to try to find the girls and then the individual. I'm going to take this opportunity to thank all of the people who tried to help the police officers, the owners in that sector who contributed in communicating with us to try to facilitate the verification of the sheds and the properties and the cottages, the partners, the police from Lévis, Transport Canada, all the people who have contributed to the efforts. I think it's important to thank them. Also, I thank the media. You were very quick to relay the information at the beginning. And I know that you're going to ask me, are we satisfied? Well, I don't think that we can be satisfied of a result where there are 3 people who have lost their lives. We all wanted to find the girls alive and healthy. Unfortunately, this was not the case. However, I can tell you today, that every day the investigators, the people who were decision makers in this file were questioning themselves. They were asking themselves. They were reevaluating each one of the strategies. Every day this was done. And obviously, like in all police operations, at the end of this one, there's a postmortem that will be done, and we will reevaluate everything that was done. We are not saying that we are perfect. However, I can tell you that today we've got the certainty that everything that could have been done was done, despite the fact that the result is not the one that we wanted to have, obviously. So I'm ready to take your questions. I'm sorry, it's inaudible. I'll answer your question. Now, when it comes to the search and why the bodies weren't found before, the trap in which we can't fall is that we can't analyze decisions that are made with elements that we did not have at that time. Today, it's easier to say, well, now that we know about the trailer, now that we know where the bodies are, well, we should have done this or that. We have to understand that every time a decision is made, it's made according to the elements that we have in hand at that time. So we have to be careful. Now, could we have found them before? I talked to you about all the searches that were done, the perimeter that was determined according to the elements that we had in hand, because we had footprints, but we also knew that the suspect, for example, was barefoot because we found one of his sandals. So now, are we satisfied? Well, I can't tell you today that we're satisfied when 3 people have lost their lives. I've already mentioned this. However, when it comes to the feeling of having done everything that we could have done, that everything that could have done was done, yes, we do believe that we did this, but we will still do a postmortem, and we will revalidate as we do. And we always want to improve, but you can agree with me that we cannot be satisfied when the result is not the one that anybody wanted. The question is inaudible. Well, it's early to answer that question because you'll understand that the criminal investigation has just finished. The coroner's investigation has not ended. There's all sorts of elements. There's always information coming in, and I can't speculate. I can't start talking about coming to conclusions at this point. I can't hear you. Concerning the Amber Alert, well, once again, we have to go back in time. I come back to what I was saying to your colleague earlier. When we make decisions, we make them according to the elements that we have in hand at that time. And now if we go back to the night of the 8th of July following the accident, initially what we had was a vehicle that was abandoned, and we don't know what happened with the occupants. Were they picked up by another driver who was driving by there? Did they call a taxi? Did they take an Uber? And when we communicate with the family, we can identify the occupants of the vehicle, even if obviously they're worried because they were involved in a car accident. But there was nothing that led us to believe that the father was a danger to his daughters. So the worry that we've got is mostly to see what happened and not that the girls are in danger. There was no notion of kidnapping. There was no notion of immediate danger to the girls. And when we trigger an Amber Alert, that's part of the criteria. There's got to be a kidnapping, there's got to be a criminal element, and now all we had was a car accident, and we had no reason to believe that the father would not take care of his daughters. And I'll remind you as well that the ultimate objective with an Amber Alert is to inform citizens so that they can be our ears and eyes. But what the investigation has shown is that the last time that the three people were seen together alive was that night after 9 p.m., after the car accident. There were some witnesses who said they saw them run while they were going through, they were running across a highway, and then they were never seen alive by anybody else. So what I'm telling you is that even if the Amber Alert had been triggered earlier, which was impossible given the information that we had, well, it wouldn't have changed anything to the result. Well, obviously, we're going forward in time. Now it's the next day. We don't have any news. And you have to understand as well, and it's important because it's not because there's an Amber Alert that wasn't triggered that nothing was done in the first few hours. You know, immediately, some dogs were on site. We did some searches. We communicated with taxi companies, Uber, hospitals. We did all sorts of stuff to try to find them. But the presumption was that, well, perhaps they were injured, but they were safe somewhere. And despite this, we did the verification. So the turning point is that after a certain amount of time, we don't have any news. He did not manifest himself, so we're starting to worry. And through verifications, we find footprints, and we understand that they're going further and further into the woods. And that's where there are some elements that lead us to believe that perhaps there's something else going on. And that's when the Amber Alert was triggered the next day. Actually, to answer your question, so was it enough or not? Well, the first criteria is that we speak with the family. If the family tells us that they have no reason to be afraid that the father is a danger to the girls, they consider that with the father, they're safe. I'm not saying that we're not worried. We were worried because everybody wanted to know what happened. But the premise at the time was not that the father was a threat to the daughters. So what we had was a car accident with no signs of serious injuries inside the vehicle apart from the state of the car. And the presumption was that somebody had picked them up, they had taken a cab, that they had gone elsewhere, that perhaps they were safe somewhere else, and not that the father would hurt the daughters. So triggering an Amber Alert without knowing if the father was a threat to the girls would not have been logical. But there's all sorts of stuff that was done that night, and I'm coming back to this point. You know, an Amber Alert, it's not when we trigger it the next day that we start doing our work. All the work was done during the night, and overnight there were some dogs. We did some searches in the forest. We communicated with the taxis and Uber. I don't want to repeat myself, but there's all sorts of things that are doing in the investigation. It didn't start the next day when we triggered the Amber Alert.
You
have to know that the cell phone of the suspect was inside the car. So we didn't have a cell, so he could not communicate. So that gives us a potential reason to understand why communication was not made quicker. I'll give you an example. But the elements that we had at that time did not lead us to believe that the father was a danger to the girls. And that is corroborated by the discussions that we've had with the family.
Exactement. C'est exactement ça.
Exactly. When it comes to the sequence, that's exactly it. I gave you the 4 main points of the sequence of events. This is what people heard and know about the event, but for us, whether it's the car accident, the introduction into the trailer, the death of the girls, the death of the suspect, all of this, what happened in the first 12 hours. For us, the morning of the 9th, unfortunately, the tragedy had already occurred. That's what the investigation shows us.
Compléter, on peut passer à monsieur après.
Bien, jusqu'à l'embardée, là,
Well, until the car accident, the behavior of the suspect is normal.
quand on discute avec la famille,
When we talked with the family about his behavior, and you're talking about an ice cream cone. We found an ice cream cone inside the vehicle. That he's going in the right direction, so we potentially believe that he's going to drive the girls back. The investigation, the collision investigation, shows that it wasn't deliberate. He lost control of the car. He even tried to gain control of the car after. Now, after the car accident, what happened? Listen, I can't answer that question other than to tell you that for us, it's as of that time that the behavior became abnormal. No, as to his intentions, his state of mind, his motivations, I can't speculate because it's a hypothesis, it's a theory, and the coroner must do his work. I don't want to speculate because I told you at the beginning that I want to stick to facts.
OK, pour la première question, à savoir, là, non.
First question. Well, no, I did not elaborate as to how he committed suicide, and I don't have the intention to do so. I don't think it's an important detail. But it has nothing to do with the way that the girls were killed. Now, to answer your question as to the place where he was found, that's an excellent question. You know that we talk quite a bit about the search perimeter, but the reality is that there was more than one perimeter. I'll explain. There's a perimeter that's covered by the dogs. So the perimeter that the dogs do, then there's a perimeter by the walkers, by the people who are searching on site. There's a perimeter that's covered as well by the plane and the drones. There's a perimeter. So the first two perimeters that I talked about, that is the one with the dogs, and the walkers, he was just outside of that perimeter, but he was within the other two perimeters. The one with the perimeter that was covered by the planes and by the drones. Now, what we have to understand when it comes to the aerial component, with the discussions that we had with the people who were up in the air, to give you an idea, it's as if from the top of the sky we saw broccoli, and it's impossible to see what's under the broccoli. And you'll understand that if we start with the principle that everything was done in the first 12 hours, well, heat detection became an investigation technique that could not work. The other thing as well is that when it comes to the address of the property, it was visited twice by the police officers, the 10th and the 17th of July. The police officers went there. We met the owner of the property, and we discussed with them. And among the things that were found on the site where the suicide was committed, there was a ladder. And in the verifications that were done with the owner to see if there were some objects that were missing, there were several. There were several ladders, and he did not notice that a ladder was missing. And you have to understand that it's very dense. It's not visible at all from the property. So at that time, the body was not found, even if the property was visited. But still, you have to understand that it was outside of the dog perimeter and of the walkers perimeter. Now, how do we determine the perimeters? I can explain this to you because people can say, well, the perimeter should have been bigger or smaller or whatever. The elements that guide us, obviously, is our specialists, our search specialists. So I told you earlier that we knew that he was barefoot. We also knew that there were some footprints that were found, the general direction in which he was walking, because throughout these steps, he was always going south. So obviously, we always looked at the capacity to which he could move about. Obviously, if we take a step back, now that we know where he was, today it's easy to say, well, we should have made the perimeter bigger. But I always come back to the fact that when the decisions are made, they are made with the elements that we have in hand at that time. And at that time, the perimeter was identified according to the information that we had.
Bien, c'est sûr qu'il fallait l'attacher. Il fallait obtenir
Obviously, we had to get the equipment. Could we have done so earlier? Well, you know, there's a lot of decisions that are made according to the elements that we have, and I want to explain to you, as I said earlier, the conclusion is that now it's clear that it couldn't have worked for the reasons that I mentioned. But beyond that, if the individual was still alive, we're far from certain that we could have detected a trace of heat given the density of the forest. I'm not a specialist, and I don't want to go into the minute details, but it wouldn't have changed anything. Could it have been done earlier? Well, you'll understand that we have to do some work. There was all sorts of other things happening in the investigation. You know what? If we were a week later in time, and if we still hadn't found the body, there are probably some other techniques or other methods or other things that we could have done. So I'm telling you once again, I come back to this point, obviously, we will revisit all the decisions that were made. But today, I must tell you that we have the feeling that everything that could have been done was done, especially now that we know how fast the tragedy unfolded, unfortunately.
Je vous entends pas bien, par contre, je m'excuse.
Now that the criminal investigation is done, because the only suspect has died, the coroner's taken over. And our role will be to assist the coroner. As I said, there is still some information coming in. We've got some verifications to do, but now it's really the coroner's mandate. And that's why I don't want to speculate as to his state of mind, etc., because the police work, the criminal work is done. Yes, we'll continue to work to assist the coroner. But for us, when it comes to the criminal investigation, that's done. That's over.
To
answer your first question, as to what happened before the car accident, well, we know where they were. We can determine that they went to get ice cream, as I mentioned earlier, and the behavior, the suspect's behavior was expected behavior up until the car accident. Now, when it comes to the cell phone, you are right. There's a call that came in on the cell phone, on the suspect's cell phone, and we got the call from the former in-laws. They communicated there. That happened about an hour after the car accident, I would say, more or less. There are some hypotheses and theses, but I don't want to go there, and I'm going to repeat myself again. Obviously, the investigators, parallel to the search that was done, there's still an investigation for a double murder. So yes, we've got some hypotheses. What I'm telling you today is not that we don't have any, it's that I don't want to go there, because right now it's a coroner's mandate, and out of respect for the coroner, I don't want to go there, but know that everything that was done during the investigation will contribute to the coroner's work, and we will continue to contribute to this. But today, I cannot speculate on anything. I don't want to go there. I'll answer you, and you'll think it's a drag, but I'll tell you that for us, up until the car accident, the behavior of the individual was normal. This is what we expected, this kind of behavior. Now, when there was a car accident, everything that follows that is what is abnormal. Now, what was going on in his mind, I don't want to go there, Mr. Poirier.
Allez-y, Monsieur Poirier. Je ne suis pas membre de l'état-major, mais je vous écoute. Okay.
Mr. Poirier, I will tell you, I want to be honest and transparent. I will tell you that for me, Mr. Prudhomme is a man of integrity. For the rest, I'm not going to comment on this. I'm sorry, I can't comment on that.
Yep. Well, there was worry, but you have to understand that they were implicated in a car crash. So it was a worry with regards to what their status or their health was following the car crash. But it wasn't a worry of what the father might do to the daughters. So that's why I'm saying we did do a lot from the get-go. We did some ground search. We had the dogs out. We checked taxis, Ubers, hospitals. But the angle of how we were worried was based on the fact there was a car crash, and we didn't know if they'd gotten out of the car, if they'd gotten help. And it wasn't a worry that the father would do anything to the daughters. And that was exactly what we were getting from the family, that obviously they were worried because they wanted to know what happened. But their worry wasn't towards how the father would act towards his daughters. And that's the very important, I'd say, variable that doesn't lead us to sending out the Amber Alert right away, because while we are worried, we weren't worried that the daughters are in danger from their father, and we're not looking at a kidnapping type scenario. Well, again, aside from how the state the car was in, there's no traces inside the vehicle of severe injuries. Now, the cell phone was left behind, could have been forgotten behind in the stress of the accident, could have been picked up by a passing car, a taxi, could have been in a hospital, could have been at a friend's house. The premises was we weren't worried that the father would hurt the daughters. So we were looking for them, but it makes no sense that you're going to send out an Amber Alert stating that you're worried for the welfare of two daughters from their father when the family, while they are worried, aren't worried about how he's going to act. So there has to be, you have to have the element of kidnapping if you're going to go out and send an Amber Alert. That being said, a lot was done during that evening. It's not that we were standing still and waiting. It's just that the Amber Alert in itself wasn't sent out. And at the end, you have to remember that the purpose of the Amber Alert is to get citizens to be alert of what's going on, to open their eyes, their ears. And in this case, we can establish that the last time that the three were seen alive was in the minutes following the car crash, when they went into the woods, and they were never seen alive after that. So notwithstanding the fact that we didn't send out the alert on that evening, the next day, it wouldn't have changed anything, because following the car crash, except from the time where people saw them cross the highway and go to the woods, they weren't seen alive again. Well, okay. Basically, what the investigation tends to show is that it wasn't a deliberate car crash. The suspect lost control of the vehicle. Our car accident specialists combed the scene and come to the conclusion that it wasn't a voluntary car crash, and even that there are traces showing that he tried to regain control of the vehicle prior to going off the road. Every behavior that was noted that's been determined during the investigation prior to that moment is behavior that is normal, that fits what we would expect from that individual, except that from that point on, after the crash, it's everything else after that that doesn't add up to what we would call normal behavior. Now, what the investigation tends to show is that following the car crash, they walked into the woods, they crossed the highway, walked into the woods towards the south, a distance of 1.7 kilometers, where the suspect went into a shed that was there, and the investigation tends to show, and that was released. That was something we told you last Thursday. The investigation tends to show, because of the DNA that was found on the premises, that the suspect was really the one that broke in. We didn't find the daughter's DNA, but for us, it simply means that they didn't go inside the building at that time. About 750 meters further south is where, sadly, the bodies were found. The daughter's bodies were found, and At that point in time, we believe that while what the investigation shows with the autopsy reports is that while the daughters had been hurt in a car crash, they were killed. They were killed by a blunt object used by the suspect at that place, at that area. Following that, the suspect continued south, where he was found last Monday, which is about 5.5 kilometers from the initial crash. And basically, what we know now, today, given the autopsies, given the investigation, is that all these events that I just related to you all occurred in a very small time frame following the accident. We believe that on the morning of the 9th of July, sadly, all those sad events had already been played, and all three were already dead. That's what the investigation tends to show right now. Well, it's a good question. The first thing I have to keep in mind, and I was telling that before in French, I was saying, it's easy today, with everything that we know, to look back and second-guess some decisions, but you always have to go back in time when a decision was taken based on the information that was available at that time. The perfect example is the shed where he broke into, which we only discovered Wednesday of last week, and we told you on Thursday. So everything before that, every decision taken before that, is based on the fact that we don't have that information. How we know now that everything was played in the first 12 hours, well, again, I mentioned the autopsies. Now, it wasn't possible to know what state the corpse would be, what the autopsy would show before we found it. So that was, in a sense, part of the missing piece to be able to ascertain the sequence of events. With regards to not finding them sooner, well, the search is based on the information that we have. It was based on footprints that we found. It was based on the fact that we knew the suspect was traveling barefoot because he lost one of his sandals in the car. It was based on the fact that until we found the daughters, he was traveling with 2 children. It was based on all these information, on the density of the forest by the experts. It's easy today to look back and say, well, you know what, the perimeter should have been this wide or this long or this large. Now we know where they were. But going back on the information that we had at that time, we feel that it was the right call. Do we wish we would have found them sooner? Obviously, but we had to go with what we had. And I can tell you, everything that was done, whether it's the search on the ground with all the resources, whether it be the quads, the dogs, the officers, the plane, the drones, the chopper, all the resources that were put to work to find them, and all the investigation that was done, because people relate a lot to the search, and people focus a lot on that because that's what they can see. But remember, at the end of the day, it's over 1,000 information that we received that had to be checked, double-checked by investigators, which led to meeting witnesses, maybe getting recordings from surveillance cameras, and all that work had to be done. That's 1,000, over 1,000. So you can imagine what that represents, what type of work. So today, are we satisfied with the result? Well, you can't. I don't think you can be satisfied when the end result is the 3 of them being dead. I think everybody wanted to find the daughters alive. That was the whole purpose. That being said, we're confident that everything that could have been done was done. And again, that being said, every day, on every single day, at the end of the day, when people making the decisions would meet, they would second guess, ask, think how they could push this further, what else they could have done. And even now that the operation is terminated, the investigation is concluded, for sure there's going to be a postmortem. For sure we're going to look back, we're going to debrief, and we always want to be better for the next time. But we really feel that everything that could have done was done. I'm sorry, I didn't hear the beginning of your question. Okay, well, it's a bit complicated, but you have to understand that while we always refer to one perimeter, it's actually more than one perimeter, because there's a perimeter that's determined for the dogs, for the search that the dogs are going to do. There's another perimeter that's determined for the officers that'll walk the woods, if you like, that will search physically the woods. There's another perimeter for the quads, and there's another perimeter for the plane with the heat sensor and the drones. So the first two perimeters I mentioned, which is the one for the dogs and the one for the searchers on the ground, he was slightly outside that perimeter. But he was inside the perimeter that was used by the planes, by the drones, and also the perimeter that was used by the quads. Now, obviously, the heat sensors, well, looking back now, knowing that everything was played in the first 12 hours or even earlier than that, we can look back now and understand that it wasn't maybe a good strategy in the sense that we couldn't have found heat signatures. But even telling you this, and I'm not a specialist, but from what I hear from what was told to me by the investigators, is that from the sky, what you can see is basically nothing, because the trees, the way they're made, you can't see the ground. And it was so thick that it's even possible that, given the altitude, that the heat sensors wouldn't have worked. Now, I'm not a specialist. I'm just saying what I was explained. So also I'm mentioning that we did visit that property, those premises where he was found, actually found in the woods, close to that property. It was visited twice, on July 10th and July 17th by officers. We even had a conversation with the owner there, asking if he had seen anything, if he had noticed anything missing from his property. When we found Carpentier, when he ended his life, there was a ladder that was found there. But when we met with the owner, which owns a few ladders, he hadn't even noticed that one of the ladders was missing. So we had no elements that would have brought us to search more into detail, given the fact that we were outside the ground search perimeter. And I can tell you that where he was found, it wasn't something that was easily visible from the property, and the forest is very dense in that area. I don't have that information. The information I have is that on Monday is the first time that was brought to our attention, and I don't have any information pertaining to the fact that there was a smell or anything before that. No, I don't have that information. It's a very good question. It's always a question of balance, right? Because, I mean, we can understand that practically everybody in Quebec was following the story. People wanted to know. People are curious. You guys have a job to do. I understand that. But for us, it's always the balance between letting some information out and protecting the investigation. And as days were going by, we weren't finding Carpentier, and we didn't know if he was alive or not. So we also had to ascertain that he might have been holed up, maybe in a chalet somewhere, maybe had access to a radio, to a cell phone, to a television set, and he was hearing everything that we were telling you and that you were telling the public. So you have to take that into consideration. An example I can give you is until today, we never mentioned the fact that for us, we were investigating a double murder. Well, why we didn't tell you that? It's quite simple. We were still hoping that at some point, if he was still alive, he would come out and he would give himself up. Now, if we're going to go public and say that all of a sudden now what we're chasing is a murderer, well, we're not really giving incentive to come out and turn himself in. So that's the type of decisions you have to take. It's tough because people want to know, and I understand people are curious. But at the end of the day, I think the right call is the one to protect the investigation. That's the way you got to go. And I think today I've been very straightforward for as much as we know as facts, because again, I don't want to go into hypothesis, but when you don't know if the suspect that you're tracking can hear what you're saying, then you got to be watching what you're saying, obviously. I could go specifics. There was a shovel, there was a lighter, items that were found where the daughter's bodies were found. But for us, it's significant in the sense that we're able to put them there in a certain timeline that he was there because we found the DNA. That's what's important for us in that situation. It's a good question. Obviously, you can understand that all the groundwork, all the background work was done. The reason I don't want to go into that today, of course we have hypotheses, of course we have theories, but now it's the coroner's job. And for me today, the criminal investigation being concluded, because for us, we're convinced at the end of it, an investigation shows that there's no accomplice. He was working alone. Out of respect for the coroner's work, I don't want to go into that. I'll let the coroner do their work, but know that everything that was done in the investigation will be available for the coroner to do their job. But I don't want to go into specifics regarding to that. Okay, well, again, it sticks to the facts. I can tell you that eyewitnesses saw them crossing the highway, that one of the daughters was walking, the other one was being carried by her father. I don't want to go into any further detail than that. With regards to how far, I can tell you they were found 2.4 kilometers from the scene of crash. But one thing I can tell you, and one thing I want to tell you, it's very important that you just brought to mind for me, is when I told you that everything was done, investigators went as far as walking barefoot to see how difficult it was to move in that forest, not wearing any shoes. That's how far we went to try and ascertain how he was moving, where he was going, how far he could go to determine where he could be. So that kind of shows you what kind of state of mind the officers working the case were in, that they would go to the point of walking barefoot the way he was walking barefoot to try and ascertain what kind of mobility he was looking at. Yeah, the daughters were found very close to each other, yes. You're welcome. Je ne peux pas vous dire, M. Poirier, on va revenir là-dessus.
I can't tell you, Mr. Poirier. We'll get back to you on this. Thank you.